Hello, participants in AHVS 311F horror video games, and welcome to what will be the last full lecture of the course before we have our final quiz and the final submission of assignments on Monday, March 30th. As previously, along with this video lecture uploaded to the CourseSpaces LMS for this course, there is an accompanying PowerPoint presentation. And as before, I will indicate verbally when it's appropriate to proceed to the next slide of the PowerPoint presentation, also uploaded to the CourseSpaces LMS for this week of the course. And I'll also integrate images from the slides right into this video presentation, so you have both of those resources available to you. So today, for our last class, we will be discussing a few aspects of the many aspects of the cultural impact of horror video games, which of course affects much more than the now obsolete demographic stereotype for video games in general. According to Vivian and Morin in their survey of Canadian media industries, the Entertainment Software Association of Canada says that almost half of Canadian households own a video game system, and that statistic is probably better than a decade old now. And it's not just kids playing either. The average age of a gamer in Canada is almost 36 years old, and women at the time of their survey made up as much as 35% of the video game market in Canada. And as Rob Cover from our reading for today states, and I quote, although it is certainly true that younger persons, children, and teenagers make up a significant portion of the known game player demographic, proportion of the known game player demographic, it's certainly also the case that games are becoming a popular lifestyle choice, he says, among adults. Particularly, of course, since the marketing of Sony's PlayStation 2 and Microsoft's Xbox. So even that statistic is obviously a little bit dated, as we're into generations above both of those systems at this point in history as well. But I do remember in the popular media, especially when PlayStation 2 came out, jokes being made, ones that I recall on, for example, Saturday Night Live, made by Jimmy Fallon, who was on that television show at the time, about his inability to get married because he was busy with his PlayStation 2. And in the cover article, he says that the stereotypes of the average game player as the nerdish lad in the darkened basement or the psychopathic youth planning to blow up his school are certainly in the process of being surpassed. Indeed, Cover says, we have moved beyond the stereotype of gaming as a masculine pastime. Girls and women are playing games, though the game genres of choice are often different, he points out. The Sims as a family, simulation rather than first-person shooter games, such as Wolfenstein, are the examples he gives as being popular with each of the genders respectively. And amongst the effects that we're going to look at in this lecture of video games in general and horror video games in particular include things like indoctrination and social control. Douglas Kellner, a respected and celebrated cinema and media theorist, in his text Theory Wars, he states that on one hand, novel media technologies provide more diversity of choice or possibility of autonomy over culture and more openings for the interventions of alternative culture and ideas. Yet, he says, the new computer technologies also provide new forms of surveillance control, with electronic eyes and systems in the workplace providing a contemporary incarnation of Big Brother, making reference to George Orwell's 1984. Now, of course, that contention by Kellner is more about the workplace than digital media gaming. However, he goes on to say, the new media technologies also provide powerful forms of social control through more efficient, subtly concealed techniques of indoctrination and manipulation. And certainly this last statement resonates with the Kachurik article that was assigned for today that I will review a little bit later in this lecture. And I'd also like to refer to an essay from the 1990s, I believe, by media theorist and sociologist Donna Haraway in her theorizations of the social cyborg. Haraway says that the culture of video games is heavily oriented to individual competition and particularly to extraterrestrial warfare. High-tech, gendered, she says, imaginations are produced here. Imaginations that can contemplate destruction of the planet and a science fiction escape from the consequences of that destruction. But more than that, she says, our imaginations in video games are militarized, and other realities of electronic and nuclear warfare are inescapable. And she goes on to say that sex and sexuality and reproduction are central actors in high-tech myth systems, structuring our imaginations of personal and social possibility. Her point is that these landscapes of fantasy under the radar indoctrinate us into potentially and usually misogynistic social normativities, as well as the normalization of military and militarization as the solution to social problems, even if they're fantastically extraterrestrial in the video games to which she's referring. So at this point, I'll invite everyone to switch to the second slide now in the PowerPoint presentation that accompanies this lecture video. And I'll let you know that what I intend to do is review the two articles that were assigned for today. In summary, the Kachurek article is really, she's wary of the normalization and trivialization of violence in video games. And the article by Rob Cover, his contribution has to do with the discursive production of the addiction myth to video games. And this essay is largely imbued with concerns about legitimate addiction and with the ways that excessive exposure to violence can affect audiences. Unfortunately, I find Cover somewhat dismissive of this latter concern, to which I will certainly add some comments later. Now, in summary, Cover demystifies the stereotype and circulation of the myth of the video game addict as it is produced particularly in discursive practices. What Cover says, and I've added the adjective discursive here, is that a simple insertion of the signifier game in place of drugs indicates quite neatly the discursive ways in which the digital addict is produced in contemporary culture. Cover's quite clear that although the vast majority of studies undertaking the examination of electronic games and the emergence of a gaming culture deny that games are addictive, a stereotype of the game player as addicted continues to circulate in various strands of ego psychology and pedagogical study, and with even greater force and political effect, of course, in popular culture, including news media and governmental rhetoric. He goes on to say that what's at stake is how the various sets of knowledges that produce and affirm the stereotype of the addicted game player are circulated through stereotypes, which link an image to an idea. Stereotypes, according to Cover, link the image of the game player to an idea. Fixing a long-term relation between the imaginary figure of the game player and the idea that game playing in general is addictive. But Cover goes on to explain that this only occurs through a particular set of ingrained attitudes that have emerged partly from a high culture denunciation of gaming as a valid form of textual engagement, and partly through a set of moral panics around gaming as they emerge every few years in a variety of contexts. And he refers to, actually, Jacques Derrida's a typical play on words in his French to English translation versions of his theorization of post-structuralism and deconstructionism. And Cover says the application of the diction of addiction to gaming operates within a nexus of other discriminations, including class and age issues. The stereotype that gaming is predominantly not only a middle class youth entertainment form, but that the gaming console is found in the homes and trailers of an underclass is significant in making the connection between the game and the drug, so to speak. And Cover says that it works to create discursive linkage with the continuing, if discredited, stereotype that drug use is predominantly a lower class activity, as well as the idea that the street addict belongs to a particular social category of underclass. As you can see from the slide for this part of the lecture discussion, Cover is actually particularly critical of an article by K.S. Young from 1988 entitled "Caught in the Net: How to Recognize the Signs of Internet Addiction." And Cover's quite critical of her particular reliance on time expired while engaged in digital communication and entertainment. He says this emphasizes the physical and local as the real, while viewing the imaginary space of the digital as the virtual or the pseudo as a lesser form of communication and experience that is considered in and of itself addictive. For Young, according to Cover, time spent online is the major criteria to indicate addiction. That is to say that her studies largely had to do with asking people how much time they spent online, comparing that to a subjective or otherwise arbitrary norm of what would be reasonable time spent online, and then asking them if they were satisfied or if they were disappointed with how much time they had spent online. And a further conceptual problem in Young's work involves the ways in which, according to Cover, she represents particular social arrangements as not only normative, but in fact desirable. In favoring her conception of real life over the mythical virtual, she privileges not only physical and geographically local relationships over communication, entertainment, and information seeking in digital forms, but she also celebrates the suburban and conservative family as a social unit hermetically sealed off from alternative friendships, relationships, and communicative practices that occur through digital means and even across distances. Now, what Cover touches on, but does not really explore, is the need to make a clear distinction between addiction versus other effects. Cover is good enough to admit that internet addiction or video game addiction may exist, but that its connection to a stereotype or the reasons that we have assigned to understanding it as addiction are discursive rather than medically oriented. And I think it's important that we recognize this distinction, that certainly exposure to video games and certainly exposure to video games, to horror video games, do have effects. And we would, I think, be a little bit naive not to consider the fact that although the discursive productions in popular culture are, of course, biased, that does not mean that there are no effects or effects that we shouldn't be concerned about. In the Cover article, he points out that Neil Selwyn identified 5 different depictions of child computer users in contemporary media. And the last 2 of these 5 are significant here. The 4th one, he says, is the depiction of the victimized user who, as an innocent, is inadvertently exposed to undesirable, violent, or sexual material. And the 5th one he identifies is the dangerous child who is actively and aggressively using ICT, which is information and communications technologies, at the ultimate risk of harming both themselves and others. Now, I think what is problematic with Cover's delimitation of these 5 honestly problematic depictions of child computer users in contemporary media is that especially these last 2 that I've just listed, they reduce the effects of media use merely, especially video games, merely to the exposure to misogyny and violence, which has its own effects, which I will come to later in this lecture. But of course, it ignores the constant exposure to and even validation of consumer culture that video games represent, both diegetically and extra-diegetically, in terms of buy more games, new game, new platform, coming out at systemic historical intervals, as low as every year or 2 years, depending on which platform you're loyal to. As well as the validation of consumer culture, or at least the normalization of consumer culture within the games themselves. Ad placement within video games, especially hugely popular and influential games like Grand Theft Auto, especially Grand Theft Auto 5, have become increasingly commonplace. All you have to do is look through the games that are claiming to simply represent reality, and they are replete with advertisements, convenient for advertisers when the reality that they are claiming to represent is itself replete with perhaps apocalyptic levels of advertising. Now, Rob Cover states that the immersion in gaming is sometimes seen as Latham, in his study of youth as consumer vampires consumed, suggests, as the transformation of youth into passive objects to be manipulated by a controlling system. Again, according to Cover, enabling a ready link between the vampirous industry and the vampiric drug dealer. And he goes on to say that although Latham usefully points out that such appreciations tend to ignore the important role of marketing games to youth and de-link gaming culture from the determinative structures of social power, part of which might be seen to sponsor compulsive game purchase and play, that they are inappropriately seen as game addiction. And I think that Cover's right, that repetitious exposure to consumerism in these games and the political economic notion that these determinative structures of power can be likened to addiction is simply incorrect. However, as you can hear from the quote that I just cited, Cover largely invokes consumerist indoctrination only to debunk it as a form of addiction, without really exploring the implications of such pervasive pro-consumerism on a larger scale. And I think that that's a weakness in the Cover article. That certainly the pro-consumerist elements of video games and horror video games which sequelize frequently with the same type of sequelization that horror films do, certainly validate a consumerist mentality without any critical eye being spread on it. I agree with Cover that I don't think that can be reduced to addiction per se, not in the medical sense of the term, but I think that he sort of glosses over the idea that this pervasive exposure to pro-consumerism has no effects and doesn't cultivate certain ideologies and simple world beliefs that might be problematic at best. So at this point in the video lecture, I'll invite you to advance now to slide 3 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation that goes along with it, which addresses, as you can see, the effects of violence that might be present in horror video. Cover states that by linking gameplay in certain popular discourses to an anti-intellectual, anti-stability, and anti-literary representation within class demarcations, the way is open for the application of the rhetoric of drug addiction to games as a means to discredit gaming and to express apprehensions over their use. Whether such discrediting, he says, and anxiety is effective is immaterial, although, like claims that gaming deterministically causes violence and aggression, it remains the case that the rhetoric of chemical drug addiction continues to be cited in political deliberations over game censorship, as well as in dialogue on the utility of games for younger persons. And again, while I agree with Cover in his attempts to disconnect the discursive tradition, which I think is incorrectly identifying the terms of addiction for video game or media use in general. The evidence, however, is clear that increased exposure to violent media, in fact, does result in, on average, more violent societies. In the citation from the assigned reading for today that I just listed, covers use of the term deterministically. Certainly invokes the idea of the hypodermic needle theory, and sort of minimizes and ignores the idea of cultivation. Now, the hypodermic needle theory has been debunked generations ago. It's the idea that media can directly inject into the mind violent ideas. And the simplest articulation of its invalidation was, children that were watching Looney Tunes did not go out and drop anvils off of cliffs onto people's heads. And yet that resolved over time into a recognition that, however, statistically, the exposure to violent media in society did lead to an increase in the social manifestation of violence on average. And it resulted in the recognition of what's called cultivation theory. The ways in which exposure to media, or media violence in this case, can cultivate certain worldviews. The last example we looked at, of course, was the example of cultivating pro-consumerism and pro-capitalist ideologies, which imbue almost all of the media that we're exposed to. And of course, violence also cultivates certain attitudes. And according to Buran and Davis, in their textbook survey of mass communications and media, the link between television, and television is where most of the studies have occurred so far, the link between television and viewer aggression is actually accepted by all but the most ardent media defenders, many of whom have interests in advertising or media distribution for commercial gains. And as a result, they say, most recent media violence research has focused, of course, on video games. And this work, based in social cognitive theory, demonstrates the causal link between violent video games and subsequent player aggression. A causal link that is not hypodermic, but is cultivated. It's cultivation-oriented. And, as such, they say, has expanded the field's confidence in the television violence findings. Now, this research is uniform in its assessment, contrary to what Cover claims about the discourse creating a false understanding of addiction, about which I think he is correct. The findings in terms of the effects of exposure to media violence are relatively sound and relatively consistent. In 2005, for example, the American Psychological Association adopted a resolution on violence in video games and interactive media, and it stated that game violence had harmful effects on youth specifically, and more generally increased hostility and aggression among players. Violent video game play was also positively related to aggressive behavior and delinquency, according to Anderson and Dill from their study in 2000. Video game violence, according to them, is positively correlated with trait hostility. Video game exposure is related to increases in aggressive behavior, aggressive affect, and aggressive cognitions. And what they mean by that is aggressive thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes, as well as to physiological arousal as a result of violence. In fact, Buran and Davis, who I mentioned a moment ago, they go on to say that 10 years after many of these studies, in 2002, Brad Bushman and Craig Anderson, who will come up later when we talk about the general aggression model. In 2002, Bushman and Anderson, they reviewed the literature and concluded that the link between media violence and subsequent aggression has more scientific support than that of the relationship between self-examination and early detection of breast cancer, more scientific support than the amount of calcium intake and bone mass, and according to them, more scientific support than the use of condoms to prevent sexually transmitted disease. And these are, of course, compelling comparisons. However, contra the hypodermic needle assertion, which we need to get past. The reduction of the hypodermic needle model, which is a theory, which is debunked, and the idea of cultivation, which remains quite ubiquitous. According to Brandon Centerwall, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, he says, manifestly, every violent act is the result of an array of forces coming together: poverty, crime, alcohol, drug abuse, stress. These are the array of forces he lists, of which childhood exposure to television is just one. So, in concert with the consequences of interactivity and amount of exposure and the processes of identification involved with interactivity, a number of researchers looked specifically at the context of media violence. And again, reputable media theorist and scholar James Potter, he actually identified 7 important contextual variables. And the first of these is reward and punishment. Rewarded aggression is more frequently modeled in media and specifically in video games. Punished aggression is less frequently modeled. And according to Potter, we know these to be disinhibitory and inhibitory in their effects, respectively. That is to say, that the idea that violence is frequently rewarded in video games tends to have a disinhibitory effect in our real social relations in society. And this concern is briefly discussed, of course, by both Cover and Kachurik, and you will have noticed that throughout the reading. The second of the contextual variables that Potter lists is consequences. So mediated violence is often accompanied by portrayals of negative or harmful consequences, produces less modeling, he calls it. And again, this shows inhibitory effects at work. And the third of the contextual variables he lists is motive. Motivated media aggression produces greater levels of modeling, and unjustified media violence results in less viewer aggression. That is to say that viewers of media violence are cued to the appropriateness or inappropriateness of using aggression. When you're talking about narrative in television or cinema and in video games, when the violence is unmotivated, generally it's attached to an enemy, and when the violence is justified, frequently it is attached to some form of a protagonist. And this is something that Kachurik takes up quite vehemently, especially in her analysis of Red Dead Redemption, which I'll come to later in the lecture. The fourth of Potter's contextual variables is realism. And Potter says that especially with boys, realistic media violence tends to produce more real-world aggression. Potter explains, quote, realistic media perpetrators are more likely to reduce inhibitions because their behaviors are more applicable to real-life situations than are unrealistic perpetrators, such as cartoon or fantasy characters. Now, I find this deeply problematic. Not only is the definition of realism highly contentious in both cinema and video game theory, but as we've also noted from our discussion last week, in terms of virtual reality, realism becomes, I think, less of a mediating factor in terms of our repetition or modeling of violent behavior. Once the suspension of disbelief is rendered irrelevant and only the context of immersion in media reception is relevant, then realism certainly falls away as a significant factor, although Potter suggested that the closer to realism, the more likely we will have, especially amongst young boys, of modeled behavior. And the fifth of Potter's categories was humor. And he explains that because it reduces the seriousness of the behavior, humorously presented media violence leads to the greater probability that viewers will behave aggressively in real life. And this significantly echoes Kachurik's concern for the trivialization of media violence in video games. especially in two of the case studies she presents. Again, I'll discuss that a little bit further below. But by blowing enemies apart in, for example, Lego Indiana Jones, which is reduced simply to the deconstruction of a Lego character, violence is not only humorized but trivialized, which is done worse in different games that she discusses, and I'll come back to that later. The sixth item on Potter's list of contextual variables is identification with media characters. Now, we've discussed the idea of identification extensively in our lectures throughout the course, but basically the more viewers identify with media characters, that is to say, for example, with those they consider like themselves or attractive, the more likely it is that they will model the behaviors demonstrated by those characters in their real social interactions. And the last item on Potter's list is arousal. Now, this is quite interesting and comes up again later in the general aggression model I'll discuss in a few moments. Potter explained that, quote, emotional appeals can serve to increase the dramatic nature of the narrative. And this can increase attention, positive dispositions toward the characters using violence, and higher levels of arousal. And this dramatically induced arousal and emotional attachment to violent characters, according to Potter, are likely to result in aggressive behavior in real social situations. Now, of course, some of these apply more or less to gaming than to television viewing, and I'll leave you to measure and balance the biases and weights of those respectively. But I would suggest that arousal might be more significant in gaming than in television in general, whereas identification with these media characters might be relatively evenly balanced. And as I've expressed already in the lecture, realism might be more significant to a television context than to a video game context. And at this point, I'm going to ask you to progress to the fourth slide in the PowerPoint presentation that accompanies this video. But I'm going to actually cut the video off here in the spirit of parsimony for uploading purposes. And I will continue with my discussion for this lecture on the fourth slide in the second video that goes along with this week's material on the Course Spaces LMS for the course.